Good evening, my holy sisters and brothers. How are you? It's great to be with you again. We weren't together yesterday, Sunday. I was involved in an all-day training for our volunteer security force, but I'm so glad to be back together today. How was your weekend? It's good to be with you now. We have a very interesting couple of pages ahead of us today. We'll be doing a double DAF and getting caught up with the DAF Yomi schedule. It's a page a day for 7.5 years. It's on a strict schedule, so whenever we skip a day, we have to make it up, and we'll be doing that today. Let's light up the darkness. All right, who is with us as we get it going on a Monday night? Excuse me. Part of the training that we had yesterday was shouting commands. You know, God forbid a bad guy comes into your synagogue and you're God and God help us so that we can de-escalate it without going to firearms. So you have to, shout commands, get down, back out, toss away the weapon, things like that. And you actually have to practice shouting commands to the bad guy. So we did a lot of shouting during that section of the class, and I'm a little bit losing my voice today. But at any rate, Pauline in Arkansas, James in Indianapolis, Yehuda in South Carolina, Paula in Chicago, Melissa in Great Neck, Renee in Indy, Stephen in New Hampshire, Sharon in New Jersey, Jennifer in Florida, Tom wishing us Shavua Tov, Paula wishing everyone a good evening from the great Northwest, Belle, Shalom from the site of Illinois, the largest earthen dam. Beautiful, thank you. Maybe you could put a picture of that in the comments. Bill from Berkeley, Ann in Merced, Lucy in Minnesota. Folks are talking to each other. I always love to see that. Rochelle in Modesto, and Joyce wishing us shalom from Philadelphia. Over there on the YouTube side, Marjorie with us from Georgia. Before we get into our double DAF, I just thought I would share a quick thought. I had a really nice meeting today with my Rav, right? Everyone has to have a Rav, even if you're the, big, not that I'm any great big strokes, but no matter who you are, even if you're a big rabbi, you have to have your rabbi, right? So anyway, I had a nice meeting with my Rav, discussed a few different things, and there's this book I've mentioned before. It's really great, Living Each Day, by Rabbi Avraham Twersky, who was just a great, Hasidic rabbi and teacher, as well as a medical doctor, a psychiatrist, and his insights are just terrific. And this Living Each Day, he sort of gives you a couple of thoughts of Torah and Hasidus for every day of the year on the calendar. And so today's date, it just happened to fall out that he was doing a little bit of a teaching based on this famous Pirkei Avos, which Hillel said, if I am not for myself, then who will be for me? But if I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? So that teaching gets brought out for a lot of different contexts. It's so wise and wise sounding that it can just get applied to a lot of different things. But the way that Rav Twersky interpreted it is really cool and kind of applicable to this idea that everybody needs a teacher, right? That's why elsewhere in Pirkei Avos it says, make for yourself a Rav and acquire for yourself a friend. You may not always have, your Rav, like your teacher that you look up to in all things, to ask all your questions of, but you should at the very least have a friend, and not just kind of generally speaking have a Rav and have a friend, but because we should always be engaged in the work of refining ourselves, right, and becoming a finer human being, a better, better husband, a better son, a better father, a better brother, a better friend, a better citizen, a better member of the community, more able to sort of, put God's will into action, as it were. But that work of character refinement, if we're just doing it on our own, and sort of, subject to the general inclination to be better, so it's not going to be as effective a character refinement project, shall we say, as if you, state that you have specific goals. It's different times. This is what I'm working on now. This is how I'm working on it. This is what I'm committing to do in order to refine my character. And to have somebody, that you enroll in that process of growth, right? Somebody who's going to keep you accountable, as it were. I mean, these are kind of, somewhat standard, self-improvement principles, but it's not like the self-help gurus of the 20th and 21st century made this up. This goes way, way back. So this is the way Rav Twersky explains this, this saying of Hillel, right, from more than 2,000 years ago, when Hillel taught, if I am not for myself, well, then who will be for me, right? If I don't believe in myself and my capacity to achieve good things and to be there for others and to be of service to this world, who else is going to believe in me? But if I'm only for myself, who am I? Now, generally, we kind of say that to mean like, you have to have some confidence, but you can't be arrogant. You have to retain your humility. And Rav Twersky says, no. What this is saying is you have to enroll another person in your growth, right? If I am not for myself, who will be? It means if I am not trying to improve myself and refine my character, well, who's going to engage in that project? I have to be the first one in on that project. And then somebody else will follow, whether it's a relative or a friend or a colleague, someone that you say, this is what I'm working on. And people always admire when people are working on themselves. And if you say, please help me, keep me accountable to the things that I'm trying to do, they will help you with that. You could definitely get help with this project. Then you say, but if I'm only for myself, what am I? Now, this doesn't mean that if I'm a selfish person and I only care about myself, then really I'm not anything but a jerk. It can be read that way, it can be taught that way. But what Rav Twersky is saying is, if I am only for myself, meaning if I'm the only one involved in the project of bettering me, I'm not going to succeed. There has to be someone else involved in that project. And having heard this little teaching, and you say to yourself, yeah, that's good. Sal, that makes sense. I will find somebody to help be my accountability partner in the growth that I'm trying to do. I'll do that. And then you form that as a general, at some point I'll do that. So then it won't happen. And so that's why Hillel adds at the end of the teaching, if not now, when, right? If you think it's good to have an accountability partner, decide who it's going to be, or maybe put it on your to-do list, pick who I want to ask to be my accountability partner. Take as long as you need to make that decision, and then go ask that person to be your accountability partner, or it won't happen. And like so many projects, it'll just turn into smoky wisps of nothing that evaporate, and it's as if the intent was never there. So it's a really beautiful teaching of Hillel's in any case, but particularly the way that Rav Twersky interprets it. And it was funny to me to read that teaching just on a day when I was having this kind of a conversation with my Rav. Okay. Excuse me. All right, so where are we? Today's going to be a double page, a double DAF to get us back on the schedule. So we're going to be doing DAF Zayin and DAF Ches, page 7 and 8 here in Tractate Yoma, the 6th volume of the Talmud. We're generally studying the Laws of Yom Kippur, and we're going to be going through them. And by the way, this week's Torah portion is the Laws of Yom Kippur. So nice coincidence, nice accident, as it were there. And this tractate is going to be going through the laws of Yom Kippur as they were observed in the ancient world when either the tabernacle or the temple was standing and the high priest was serving and making an atonement on behalf of the nation. And the first Mishnah of the first chapter here is all about the idea that they sequester the high priest for 7 days prior to Yom Kippur. And we've been discussing quite a bit about what is the source for the sequestering of the 7 days and what is it that they're trying to accomplish by sequestering him for 7 days. Is it just to make sure that he's in a state of ritual purity, he's not coming into contact with sources of impurity? Or is it to prepare him spiritually for that encounter with the divine that he will have on Yom Kippur when he steps into the Holy of Holies and steps into the divine presence, as it were? Now, one of the question that was just asked on page 6, and this is the flow of where we are now, it said, okay, well, we separate him from his wife during that 7 days to make sure that there's no possibility that they unwittingly will, cohabit while she, it turns out, is in a state of ritual impurity by having her menses, and that could render him impure and disqualified from performing the obligations of the high priest on Yom Kippur. And then the question was asked, well, shouldn't we prohibit all visitors to the high priest while he's living in the temple compound for that 1 week before Yom Kippur, just on the off chance that somebody comes to visit him, and while they're having tea in that special room in the high temple where the high priest is sequestered, this visitor drops dead of a heart attack. And now the high priest is in a room with a dead body, and so he would contract tuma, ritual impurity of a corpse by virtue of being under the same roof, the same ceiling with this dead body. And then that would render him impure, and he would be disqualified from serving on Yom Kippur. And then the Gemara said, well, no, we don't have to worry about that. But why don't we have to worry about that? Is it because it's such an unlikely event that we're not going to restrict them from ever having visitors just on the off chance that one of them has a heart attack and dies while they're having a visit? It's so unlikely. Or is the reason that we don't worry about that because even if he did die and the priest became tameh, ritually impure, he could still discharge his duties on Yom Kippur because that particular ritual impurity, even though it's a very strong ritual impurity, does not disqualify a priest from bringing offerings in the temple if the offerings are of a communal nature. A priest who is tameh cannot bring the offerings of an individual up on the altar, but for the community, for the public, he can. And we learn that law from the fact that when the majority of the community is itself tameh, like there was a war and there was a lot of, dead bodies around in the streets and the people are all ritually impure, then we still bring the offerings of Passover in its time. And from that we learn that for communal offerings, even if the priest is the only one who is tameh, if he brings the communal offerings, he doesn't disqualify the offerings, he can do it. Then the question was asked, okay, a priest who is tameh can bring communal offerings in the temple, but is the exception to the rule that he can bring this stuff when he's tameh, is it because we have an absolute permit that when it comes to communal offerings, it doesn't matter whether the priest is ritually impure or not? Or is it that because we need the communal offerings to be brought on behalf of the nation, we will allow a ritually impure priest to bring them, but it would be better if we had a ritually pure priest to do it? So we override the fact that tameh priests cannot bring offerings, but it's still better to have a tahor, a ritually pure priest. Or is it that when it comes to communal offerings, it really just doesn't matter? Tameh priest, tahor priest, ritually impure or ritually pure, it just doesn't matter. That's the question that we're looking at right now as we pick it up on page 7. So we're not going to do the whole 2 pages, so I'm just sort of summarizing a little bit. So a bunch of examples are given. I think it's Rav Nachman who said that it's permitted, right? Like we don't worry about it. The high priest can do it. We don't have to worry about it. But then other examples are given. Well, no, he can do it. But really, according to these various examples, we see that it would be better if we had a ritually pure priest to do it. So it would seem that he's not absolutely permitted. It's just that we override the normal restriction. And so once we get into this analysis, we come to the tzitz. Right? So the high priest, the garb, the clothing of the high priest was different from the ordinary priests in 4 ways. In other words, the ordinary priest wears 4 garments, including, a linen tunic and a belt and 2 other garments, trousers, and I forget what the 4th is. And then the priest wears those same 4, and then he's got 4 other items on his body, which are only for the high priest to wear. And there's a hat on all of them. So, but the high priest, in addition to that, so he has the breastplate, which has the 12 stones representing the 12 tribes of Israel, and a few other objects. And then one of those additional 4 objects is the tzitz, the front plate. So he wears a strip of gold, literally gold, on his forehead. It's tied to his head. There's like a ribbon that goes over the top and 2 that go around the back. And that keeps it in place right in front of his head. And it says in Hebrew on this gold plate, holy to Hashem. He is in a state of sanctity, dedicated in all that he does to performing God's will. Holy to Hashem, it says on the front plate. And we've learned elsewhere, it says it in the Torah, that this front plate, it's not just sort of the garb of the high priest that identifies him as the high priest, but in addition, this front plate itself, this golden front plate, has a very powerful sanctity and a very powerful energy, which actually makes an atonement for certain sins among Israel. Namely, sins having to do with the sacred in the temple. What are those sins? It's when offerings that are supposed to be in a state of absolute purity, either unwittingly or even intentionally, like somebody knew it was this way but didn't tell anybody and just brought it anyway, but where offerings that should have been in an absolute state of purity were brought in impurity, which would be a desecration of the altar and a desecration of the offering process in the temple, in the holy temple. Nevertheless, mistakes are made for various reasons. And the tzitz, that's the word, the tzitz, the golden front plate of the high priest, atones for those transgressions involving the sacred in the temple precincts and among its offerings. So now the argument is made, well, wait a minute. Among the things that are listed that the tzitz atones for, like individual offerings that should have been brought in purity but are brought in a state of ritual impurity, and communal offerings that are brought in a state of impurity when they should have been brought in purity. But if we already have a teaching which says that communal offerings, it doesn't matter whether they're brought in purity or impurity because they're communal offerings, whether the priest was pure or impure or not, so why do we need among the items that the tzitz atones for communal offerings that are brought by an impure priest? Why should it matter if those things are already permitted? It must be that it's not an absolute permit for impure priests to bring communal offerings. It would be better for a pure priest to do it. So the law of communal offerings being brought by an impure priest is something that we override if necessary for the sake of the community, especially if we can't find a pure priest to bring it or to bring it in time. But it would be better to do it with a pure priest. And this seems to be evidence for that argument that among the items that the tzitz atones for is communal offerings brought by an impure priest. And we have a law. What is the halacha, the law? For what does the front plate worn by the high priest affect acceptance? The front plate affects acceptance for individual and communal offerings sacrificed in impurity. Even for offerings that were unfit to have their blood sprinkled due to impurity, the front plate affects acceptance after the fact. Right? You should not bring that kind of an offering. You should not sprinkle its blood on the altar. But if you did, the front plate of the high priest atones for that transgression. That's where we are. And now we'll pick up the direct argument in the Gemara at the top of the B side of page 7. So, the front plate gains forgiveness only for the sin of impurity, which was exempted from its general prohibition in cases involving the public. Now, this poses a difficulty to the opinion of Rav Sheshes, who said that the prohibition of impurity is overridden in cases involving the public, as the Baraisa clearly states that impurity is permitted, right? So, again, we're testing whether it's communal offerings brought by an impure priest. Is it just an absolute permit, or we do it, but we wish we didn't have to, right? This would seem to indicate that it's permitted. It's permitted, that tzitz atones. And the Gemara responds, well, according to Rav Sheshes, the question of whether the prohibition of impurity is permitted or overridden in cases involving the public is actually the subject of a dispute between Tanaim, the earlier rabbis of the Mishnah. As it was taught in a Baraisa, the front plate affects acceptance whether it is on the high priest's forehead or whether it is not on the high priest's forehead when the offering becomes impure. This is the statement of Rabbi Shimon. And Rabbi Yehuda says, well, when he's wearing it on his forehead, it affects acceptance of these impure offerings. But if it's not on his forehead, it does not affect acceptance. Rabbi Shimon said to Rabbi Yehuda, the case of the high priest on Yom Kippur can prove that your statement is incorrect. As on Yom Kippur, when the priest wears only 4 linen garments, the front plate is no longer on his forehead, and it still affects acceptance. So we've been arguing about whether the bringing of these communal offerings by a priest in a state of impurity, whether that's just absolutely permitted or whether we just kind of put up with it, but we wish we didn't have to do it that way. And now we're going to have a parallel argument between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda, which is going to bear on our argument. And they're going to argue about whether, well, with respect to this front plate, okay, it affects atonement, it affects forgiveness from God for certain kinds of transgressions within the temple, but does it do so at all times, or does it only affect that atonement when the high priest is actually wearing it, right? So Rabbi Shimon says, no, the fact that the front plate exists, even if it's hanging on a peg somewhere, it creates this atonement. Rabbi Yehuda says, no. Only when he's wearing it, it affects that atonement. If he's not wearing it, it's not doing anything for anybody. Where am I? So Rabbi Shimon said, okay, so Rabbi Shimon says, but look at the high priest on Yom Kippur. When he goes into the Holy of Holies, right, he has a lot of things that he has to do on Yom Kippur. Sometimes he's wearing the whole outfit, sometimes he's not. But when he goes into the most important part of Yom Kippur, where he steps into the Holy of Holies, he's only wearing the 4 garments of an ordinary priest. He's not wearing that sits on his forehead, nor the hoshen, the breastplate, the other markings of the high priest that are only for the high priest. He doesn't wear those when he goes into the inner sanctuary where the Ark of the Covenant resided in the times of the tabernacle and the first temple. So Rabbi Yehuda said to him, leave the case of the high priest on Yom Kippur aside, as the atonement of the front plate is unnecessary, because the prohibition of performing the temple service in impurity is permitted in cases involving the public, as we've learned by inference that Rabbi Shimon holds that impurity is overridden in cases involving the public, and that is why the atonement of the front plate is necessary. The dispute between Rav Sheshes and Rav Nachman is based on a Tanaitic dispute, an earlier dispute, and the Baraisa cited above is in accordance, apparently, with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara proceeds to analyze this dispute between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda. So Abaye said about this dispute, in a case where the front plate broke, Everyone, including Rabbi Shimon, agrees that the front plate no longer affects acceptance, right? So whether Rabbi Shimon said whether it's on the priest or not on the priest, it creates this atonement for offerings brought in a state of impurity. But if the front plate broke, okay, now it doesn't affect atonement for anybody, no matter what. Where do they disagree, says Abaye, is in a case where the front plate is not on his head, but it's intact, it's just hanging on a peg somewhere. Rabbi Yehuda holds that the verse from Exodus 28:38, and it shall be on the forehead of Aaron, the first high priest, and Aaron shall gain forgiveness for the sin committed in the sacred things. In other words, bringing sacred things as offerings in the temple, and you did that in a sinful way, meaning the priest was impure. Okay, it's still going to be accepted on behalf of whoever was actually sending the offering, whether it's the whole public or an individual. It's going to be forgiven because this atones for that sin. Rabbi Shimon holds that the emphasis should be placed on the end of that verse, which says, "It shall be always upon his forehead, that they may be accepted before the Lord." Now, from this, Rabbi Shimon derived that the front plate always affects acceptance, even when it is not on the high priest, right? It says it shall always be on his head, right? It shall always be upon his forehead. And from this, Rabbi Shimon learns that it affects atonement even when it's not on his head. How can he conclude it's going to work for the people and create forgiveness of the fact that the offering was brought in a state of impurity, even if it's not on his head, from a law that in the Torah says it shall always be on his head? How does Rabbi Shimon come to that conclusion? And this is brilliant, and it makes perfect sense. So says Rabbi Shimon that the front plate must always affect acceptance, even when it is not on the high priest's forehead. And what is the meaning of the word always in the verse? If we say that it means that the front plate must be always on his forehead, do you find that situation in the real world, says Rabbi Shimon? Doesn't the high priest have to go to the bathroom? Doesn't the high priest have to sleep at night? Do you think that when he goes to the bathroom, he brings the holy tzitz with him, which says holy to Hashem, and which creates such an important atonement that it creates forgiveness from God for offerings, which were brought mistakenly or even intentionally in a state of impurity by the priest, but the priest was bringing the offerings either on behalf of the whole nation or on behalf of a penitent sinner who brought his offering to the temple. He's not a Kohen, he's not a priest, so he can't bring the offering himself. So this holy tzitz does a very important function that in case the priest makes a mistake, the person bringing the offering or the whole community is still going to achieve the forgiveness that they sought to achieve by bringing that offering. So it's a very holy object. Do you think that the priest is going to take such a holy object with him when he goes to the bathroom? Of course not. And the modern equivalent of that is when I'm in synagogue and I'm wearing a prayer shawl, a tallis. If I have to go to the bathroom, I don't wear my prayer shawl when I go into the bathroom, right? Most synagogues actually have a hook outside the bathroom door, and it's so you can hang your prayer shawl there so you don't bring it into the bathroom. Or if it's during the week and I'm wearing my tefillin in the morning prayers and I need to go to the bathroom, do I take my tefillin into the bathroom with me? Of course not. So says Rabbi Shimon, since it says it's always on his head, but we know it's not always on his head, the word always must be there to tell us that it always affects forgiveness, even though it may not always physically be on his forehead. Rather, says Abaye, teaching what Rabbi Shimon is teaching, it means that the front plate always affects acceptance whether or not it is on his head. The Gemara asks, and according to Rabbi Yehuda as well, isn't the verse written always? Clearly, it does not mean that the front plate must always be on his forehead. And so the Gemara answers that term, always, teaches that the high priest must always be aware. Right? See, Rabbi Yehuda says it only affects atonement when it's on his head. When it's not on his head, it's just a piece of metal. It doesn't do anything. But when it's on the high priest's head, it affects this atonement, even if it's not the high priest himself who's bringing that offering in a state of impurity. So what does Rabbi Yehuda do with the term always? Obviously, he's not always wearing it, so why did it say always? And Rabbi Yehuda interprets that the reason the word always is there is that when the high priest is wearing that sits on his head, he should be aware. He shouldn't just lapse into unawareness. He should know that he is in a heightened state of sanctity. Anytime he's wearing his garb as the high priest, he's acting in his official capacity as the high priest, and the gold plate on his head is like the most immediate reminder. Like you feel that. Just like when you're wearing tefillin and you're wearing that headpiece, the black box that sits right here, right here at the top of your forehead, and it's like a weight that's right there. Like you feel it. After a while, you might come to forget it. But in the morning prayers that we say when we're wearing the tefillin, there are times when we touch the tefillin to remind us that, okay, there's a box on my head which contains verses from the Torah written by hand. I have to conduct myself in a state of elevated holiness. How much more the priest who's there on behalf of the whole nation, according to Rabbi Yehuda, he should be touching that plate regularly and reminding himself, I am holy. The priest should be reminding he's holy to Hashem. He is holy to God. He's in a state of heightened holiness. He must conduct himself like a holy man. It reminds him of his obligations and that heightened sanctity. Now, just as with regard to the front plate, which has only one mention of God's name, the Torah said it shall be always upon his forehead, teaching that he should not be distracted from it. With regard to tefillin, have numerous mentions of God's name in their 4 passages from the Torah. All the more so, one may not be distracted from them. So it's an important lesson to us, right? Everybody wears, all Jewish men are supposed to be wrapping tefillin every day, not on Shabbos, but every other day. And when we do so, we should be mindful of what it is that we're doing. We're literally wrapping ourselves in God's name, right? And then we're reminding ourselves, okay, God created me for a reason. He sent me into this world and he made me a member of the Jewish people. And so I have the obligations of the Jews on me. There are holy things that I'm obligated to do. And I got to keep reminding myself that I'm invested with that mission and with that goal and with that objective. And I should keep reminding myself of it. In ancient times, I don't know about all Jewish men, I don't think so, but certainly the sages, they would wear their tefillin all the time. Right? Later, that became not a good idea, both for external reasons, and the way that people were persecuted, Jews were persecuted, and also it's sort of like too big a demand on a person kind of living in this world to be at that level of sanctity that you have to be when you're wearing the tefillin. And so over time, it just came to be the practice. We only put our tefillin while we're praying, not just walking around with it all the time. But when there were holy men walking around with the tefillin on all the time, okay, well, they have to conduct themselves with tremendous dignity and sanctity befitting of having numerous verses from the Torah that includes God's name literally like on their head, that they're wearing God's name. The Gemara asks, and according to Rabbi Shimon, who says that the verse, it shall be always upon his forehead, actually teaches that the front plate affects acceptance even when it is not on the high priest's forehead. Isn't it also written on his forehead and shall gain forgiveness? What does he do with the idea that the always means that you should be mindful of the fact that you're wearing the front plate? And the Gemara answers that verse comes to establish the place where the high priest should position the front plate, not to indicate that it affects acceptance only when it is on his forehead. So it's a little bit of instruction of exactly where it should sit on the forehead. And the Gemara asks, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, from where does he derive the law to establish the front plate's position on the high priest's forehead? And the Gemara answers, well, Rabbi Yehuda derives it from that which is written on his forehead. And so the Gemara says, well, what about Rabbi Shimon? let him too derive that the placement of the front plate should come from on his forehead. And the Gemara says, well, yes, it is indeed so. That is Rabbi Shimon's source. And the Gemara asks, well, rather, if so, with regard to the verse on his forehead and shall gain forgiveness, what does Rabbi Shimon do with that verse? In other words, since they have different interpretations of how the tzitz functions, right? Rabbi Yehuda says it only atones for those transgressions in the temple when it's on the high priest's head, and Rabbi Shimon says, no, it atones all the time. So since they have different interpretations of their main verse, then we have to sort of trace through how they interpret other kind of supporting verses. Wait a minute. Yes, it didn't. So what does he do? So the Gemara responds that Rabbi Shimon could have said to you, the front plate that is intact and fit for placement on the high priest's forehead, it affects acceptance. That which is not fit for placement on the high priest's forehead does not affect acceptance. And this comes to exclude a case when the front plate, when the tzitz broke, in which case it does not affect acceptance, because it's not, he says it affects acceptance whether it's on the high priest's head or not. But if it's not on his head because it's broken, then even Rabbi Shimon would admit it does not affect acceptance. So the Gemara asks, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, from where does he derive the ruling that in a case where the front plate, the tzitz broke, it does not affect acceptance? And the Gemara responds, well, he derives it from the fact that the Torah did not say forehead and instead says his forehead, teaching that it must be fit for the forehead of the high priest. And Rabbi Shimon does not learn anything from the difference between forehead and his forehead. And now we've traced through the different interpretations. I'm actually near the end. So if you have questions or comments, get them in there. So now I'm just going to teach you 4 laws that summarize some of the material that we're not reading together. So these are the halachas of these issues. The sprinkling on the high priest for Yom Kippur. So the Gemara is now going to get into the question of when the high priest is secluded for the 7 days before Yom Kippur. What do they do with him? There's going to be a lot more to say about that. But one of the things that they do is they sprinkle him with the waters of purification. So then the question is, well, do they sprinkle him every day? Or do they sprinkle him on the 3rd and 7th days? The 3rd and 7th days is when you are sprinkled, when you came into contact with a human corpse, and you have to go through the purification from contact with the corpse. And that includes sprinkling with the waters of purification on the 3rd and 7th day. This is he didn't come into contact with a corpse that we know of, but maybe he walked over a grave and we weren't aware of it. So just to be absolutely sure, we sprinkle him. And this is part of the same analysis. Well, wait a minute. If it doesn't matter whether he's contracted corpse tumor or not, if it's just permitted, why do we bother sprinkling him? It must be that we override the laws of being tamei by virtue of corpse tumor, but we would prefer that he be as pure as possible, and that's why he's sprinkled. Well, if so, why not sprinkle him every day? Because maybe he contracted that corpse tumor 1 day before he went into the sequestering, or 2 days before he went into the sequestering, or 3 days before he went in. And so since we're not sure if he came into contact with it at all, but just to cover our bases, since he might have come into contact on any one of those days before he went into the sequestering, we should sprinkle him with the waters of purification every day. What is the law? The priests, the ordinary priests, sprinkle the purification water on the high priest on the 3rd and 7th days of his sequestering prior to Yom Kippur, unless one of those days is Shabbat. The Rambam rules in accordance with the opinions of Rabbi Yosei and Rabbi Hanina. So we don't sprinkle him every day. We'll take him through that process, but we don't really worry about if he happened to have become impure by virtue of walking over a grave, which is corpse tumor. We're not going to concern on which particular day that happened. We're just going to go through that purification process once, not try to sort of do every base every day. Similarly, we've already said that there's a comparison between the high priest who serves on Yom Kippur, and he is sequestered for 7 days, and the priest who is tasked with slaughtering and burning a red heifer, from whose ashes we create the waters of purification. And there were only 9 red heifers in all of Jewish history. So this ceremony happened 9 times. And the first one was with the children of Israel in the wilderness. So that priest who's going to, the issue is he must be in a state of absolute purity, since, he's going to be responsible for collecting the ashes that purify others. So he must be in a state of absolute purity. So you might think that with him, we would sprinkle him every day with these waters of purification during his sequestering. But the priest sprinkled the purification water on the priest who burns the heifer on the 3rd and 7th days of his 7-day sequestering, lest he became impure with impurity imparted by a corpse. This is a stringency just in case, but we don't make such a stringency that we sprinkle him every day. And the question is, well, if he became impure 1 day before he went into the sequestering, or 3 days before he went into the sequestering, don't we want to immerse him at the earliest possible moment, or sprinkle him at the earliest possible moment? But a woman immersing after the conclusion of the 7 clean days following her menses is obligated to immerse at the appointed time if her husband is in town, in order to enable them to fulfill the mitzvah of procreation. In general, however, there is no obligation to immerse at the appointed time. In other words, now the only kind of obligatory immersion in a mikveh is a woman at the end of, once a month, so that she and her husband become permitted to each other, or a convert to Judaism just does it once, or she does it once when they make their conversion. Otherwise, there is no immersion because the temple is not standing, and so much of the immersion was to enter the temple compound or to eat sanctified foods, and we don't have either of those anymore since the temple was destroyed. However, with respect to those kinds of immersions, do we mandate that they be done at the earliest possible moment? Or, okay, they immerse when they immerse. They don't have to immerse at the earliest possible moment. They simply have to immerse before they enter the temple compound, or they simply have to immerse before they eat teruma or other consecrated food. But there's no additional mandate that they immerse at the earliest possible moment, and that is the law. And then in part of that discussion is, well, if a person needed to immerse at the earliest possible moment, what if for some reason he had a name of God written on his body? This would be a problem because, and it's not even talking a tattoo, like if for some reason somebody had, with a pen, somebody wrote God's name on your body, it's a huge problem because you can't erase God's name. It is prohibited to erase God's name. So you have to sort of let the ink wear away. But what if you needed to immerse so that you could enter the temple? Then what do? So then, now you have a problem because to immerse, you have to be naked, and you can't be naked in the presence of God's name. It's disrespectful. So how did they handle that? They would put like loose clothing or a reed, some kind of a reed over God's name, but in a way that it's loose so that water of the immersion could get, all over the person's skin. And it would be like a, sort of difficult circumstance in how to handle that. But so do you wait until you can get the reed or the loose fitting clothing so that you can make your immersion? Or do you wait until the name just wears away? Or, are you commanded to immerse at the earliest possible time? But you're not commanded to immerse at the earliest possible time. A person who has a sacred name inscribed on his skin may neither bathe, nor smear oil on his flesh, nor stand in a place of filth. In the event that he is obligated to immerse, he wraps a reed over the name and immerses. If he has no reed, he loosens his garments to avoid an interposition between him and the water of the immersion, and makes certain not to stand naked in the presence of the divine name. Right? So you cannot be naked in front of something which bears God's name on it. I'm very close to done. And then there's just a point here quickly made that so the difference between preparing a priest for burning the red heifer is physical purity. He has to be in a state of ritual purity, and we just want to make sure that he hasn't had any kind of contact with any sources of impurity. We're concerned about impurity with the high priest before his service on Yom Kippur, but with him, the greater, more important purpose of his sequestering in the temple is actually the sanctity. Not the purity, but the sanctity, meaning he is preparing himself spiritually, inside and out, mentally, emotionally, in every which way for that encounter with the divine presence. And last two short paragraphs, having discussed the obligation to sequester the high priest, this is near the bottom of the B side of page 8, having discussed the obligation to sequester the high priest prior to Yom Kippur, the Gemara interprets the next matter in the Mishnah, in our Mishnah. We're back to the Mishnah now. The high priest is removed from his house and he's sequestered in the temple compound, where? In the chamber of Parhedrin. It was taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Yehuda said, and was it called the chamber of Parhedrin? The chamber of the annual royal appointees? Like this word Parhedrin, it actually refers to Roman officials who were appointed for annual terms. Why would you use such a word to describe a room in the temple compound where the high priest is sequestered in sanctity as he's preparing for Yom Kippur? Why would you use such a word to describe that room? So says Rabbi Yehuda, wasn't that room actually called the chamber of the Balvati, the chamber of ministers and council heads? Now this is actually a Greek word. So what we're learning here is that these are kind of nicknames. This is certainly not what the room was originally named by King Solomon when he built it, or even by Ezra and the returnees from the exile when they sort of rebuilt the first temple in the more modest second temple. Why did this chamber in which the priest was sequestered have this kind of weird secular name, either called the room of these annual, like a word that's used to describe Roman officials who just serve 1-year terms, or this other word, which is a Greek term, which sort of refers to like sort of senators and governors, much higher up, more important officials who serve much longer terms. So which is it? Which is the actual name of the room? In our Mishnah, it said the chamber of the Parhedrin. So rather, it's explained that during the era of Shimon HaTzadik, who was a high priest, and his colleagues, and Shimon HaTzadik means Shimon the righteous. So during that era, the high priests had long terms. Like Shimon HaTzadik, I think, was the high priest, I think, for 80 years. I mean, they served as high priests for a very long time. And remember that when the high priest enters that chamber, the Holy of Holies, if he's not of a sufficiently, in a sufficient state of sanctity, personal sanctity, he will die, right? His soul will leave his body when he's in the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, and they won't be able to retrieve him. That's why they would tie a rope to his ankle when he went in case he died, they could pull him out without somebody having to go in there. So sort of in the earlier high priests, they truly were righteous men, and they survived and had that position for many years. And so then it was called the chamber of the Balvati. However, because people were giving money in order to be appointed to the high priesthood, the position came to be filled by unworthy individuals. And due to their wickedness, they did not survive the year, and they were replaced every 12 months, like the Parhedrin, these lowly Roman officials who only had 1-year terms, and who are replaced every 12 months. Therefore, the chamber came to be called disparagingly the chamber of the Parhedrin. Since the high priest was replaced every year, the new appointee would renovate the chamber to reflect his own more elaborate tastes. And isn't it amazing that that would happen? I guess it's not so surprising because these people, what happened was that the kingdom, just really dipped its level of holiness, its level of faith, its level of closeness to God, really took a nosedive later in time. And that's why we eventually lost the second temple. And there were kings who were involved in idolatry. And we've talked about them, how some kings were just steeped in idolatry, famous evil kings like Menashe and Ahab, and others. And then there were kings who would make a teshuvah, like King Yoshiahu, who came, even though his father and grandfather were idolaters, he was more like his great grandfather Hiskiyahu, and he would bring the people back to relationship with the Holy One. But later in that Second Temple period, there were a lot, there were wicked kings and there were wicked high priests who were just after the power. It was a corruption thing. And they would actually buy their way into the high priesthood. You'd think they'd know better if, very often these high priests would die. The corrupt ones who, weren't serving in a state of holiness ended up dying. Like, why would you pursue that? But people who were pursuing that position for corrupt reasons, I guess they didn't believe in the power, of the Lord to, remove a corrupt high priest from his position, with full... with maximum prejudice, as it were. Okay, let's go to your comments and questions. Okay, Sharon, Friend, Brooks, why is there a need for it to be one or the other, i.e. spiritual preparation or preserving a state of ritual purity? Couldn't it be both? I agree with you. It clearly is both. It seems, however, that in terms of the red heifer, it's really primarily physical purity. We know that it's both with respect to the high priest, but it seems like there with the high priest preparing for the encounter on Yom Kippur, we'll make sure that he's in a state of ritual purity as much as possible. But there's much more work that needs to be done with respect to his personal sanctity. And so it seems like we're just making that a little bit more primary. But it's not to the exclusion of ritual purity when we're talking about the sanctity, the preparation in sanctity of the high priest for Yom Kippur. So good point. David Kozlowski says, define supplications. Supplications are basically prayers and asking, basically making supplications on behalf of the people. Really, we're talking about bringing offerings. Right? When we're talking about the rituals of the temple, it's interesting. We don't talk that much about prayer, right? We're talking about going through these elaborate rituals which effect an atonement. Nevertheless, somebody who is bringing a sin offering because they made a mistake wants forgiveness, and part of that process is going to be prayer and asking for forgiveness. So it's not that while the temple was standing, that the only kind of relationship with the divine was, animal sacrifices, and that prayer didn't exist. Au contraire, there were synagogues in Israel at that time. There were definitely synagogues in the Second Temple period, and I believe we even have architectural evidence of synagogues in the First Temple period. So people were praying to God. It's just that there are so many laws in the Torah with respect to how offerings were brought in the temple that we're spending a lot of time discussing those. But certainly back in the first tractate of the Talmud that we studied, Brachas, that was a lot about prayer and blessings. And one of the things and then once the temple was destroyed, the whole temple service was replaced, the daily offerings were replaced with the daily prayers. So it's really, rabbinic Judaism that highlighted, the sages of the Talmud, of the tradition, who made prayer the centerpiece of our relationship with God. We still have the mitzvahs, of course, the commandments, the things that we're obligated to do in every area of life, but prayer became a really big deal. And in Tractate Brachos, we learned that in terms of supplications, right? So there's the scripted prayer, the morning, afternoon, and evening prayers. We have a script that we follow in the prayer book, but our sages teach that any prayer, now when they say the prayer, they mean the Shemona Esrei, the sort of centerpiece of each prayer service, which is the 18 blessings, sometimes called the Amidah, the standing prayer. And that's very scripted, right? It's written out exactly what it is that we're supposed to say. But the sages taught in Brachos that any prayer which is not accompanied by personal supplication, in other words, break free of the script and tell God what's really going on with you, and what you really need and what you're asking for and what you're thankful for, if you don't break from the script and get personal with God, then that actually delegitimizes the prayer itself, right? It's not a valid prayer if you don't include some personal words, right? So it's very important to have a personal relationship with God. And then later teachers like Rabbi Nachman of Breslov will take that even further and say you have to make it a daily practice to, ideally at a specific time every day, to just stop what you're doing and check in with God and tell him what's going on with you, what you're happy about, what you're sad about, what you're hoping for, what you're dreading, what you need help with, what you'd like personal strength for, who you'd like a healing for. It doesn't have to be the same every day. It shouldn't be the same every day. But you should talk to God the way you would talk to your own good friend, says Rabbi Nachman. And that's a direct outgrowth of this idea that our scripted prayers must include personal supplication. Elvis, like the priest's gear and the tefillin, isn't wearing a kippah supposed to be a reminder of a heightened state of awareness of our obligations and standards as Jewish men? But unlike the tefillin, we can wear the kippah even when we are not engaged in formal prayer or other religious duty. Yes, and yes, and yes. I'm with you, Elvis, on that. People will argue about what is the purpose of the kippah, right? And we actually encountered, I think it was in Tractate Shabbos, that one of the sages became so holy because his mom insisted that he always have his head covered even from a young age, telling us that wasn't the standard practice. So the kippah's later, right? Having your head covered at all times wasn't always there. It's certainly not commanded in the Torah. And it's like people argue about exactly when did the tradition start and what exactly does it mean. But the basic idea, yes, it's awareness of God, right? It's like, I submit me unto my Father's will, my Father in heaven. And I am aware that God is always over me. It's also, if you're wearing a kippah out in public, okay, so now you're a visible Jew. So you need to conduct yourself in a way that reflects well on your people and your commitment to God, right? If you see a person in a kippah behave badly in public, so that's a chilul Hashem, that's a desecration of the name. And it's taking on a lot to be a visible Jew. And like sort of in my journey, it took me some time to do that and to feel like I'm worthy of it. And the answer is, well, we're not really worthy of it. We're going to make mistakes, but, let's do it anyway, because by flying the flag, as it were, it forces us to elevate our behavior as much as possible. And when we occasionally make a mistake, okay, well, we really have to seek forgiveness from the Holy One for that. But yes, we elevate our behavior because we're sort of flying the flag, and that's another effect of wearing the kippah. But I agree with you. The main idea is to be reminded, that you are a servant of God, right? And that you are his servant. You're going to do your best. You're obligated, and it reminds you that you are in that state at all times. Sharon says that the high priest can be tameh. Why can't he be with his wife? That's a different kind of tumah. So what we've seen is the exception that communal offerings can be brought when somebody is in a state of tumah, specifically corpse tumah. That was what was mentioned in the case of that led to Pesach Sheni, the second Passover, because certain people couldn't bring the Korban Pesach because they were engaged in burying a body. But tumah derived, from bodily contact, etc. That's different, right? Maybe we could still make the exception, but there's definitely a distinction between corpse tumah and tumah from marital relations, as we have seen. Okay, that's what I've got for us tonight. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow for page 9 at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. You should all be blessed to grow in wisdom every day, to be safe, and to have nothing but simchas, nothing but joy in your life. Have a great night.